Howdy folks, and welcome back to Workshop Wednesday, and today I'm going to be building and painting Bress the OId Barbarian, or as I like to call him, Young Jingles, from Black Sun Miniatures. Well, I say I'm going to be building it, it doesn't come in many parts. You have the body here. There are two arms, one holding a warhammer, and then two parts making up the shield arm. The shield and the arm are separate and have to be glued together. It's a resin figure, so plastic cement won't work. You'll have to use either super glue or epoxy resin. And I'm going to have to, if I can just get it zoomed in, you can see there's a sort of very, very small gap there between his hand and his bracer. So that's going to have to be filled in with some milliput. Before I address that though, I'm going to get everything primed using the airbrush. And then I'm going to do something that I really have no excuse not to do on something this size and get the eyes painted. Whites are the eyes first, although I'm not actually painting them white. White tends to be too bright and distracting a colour. So instead, I'm painting them in Citadel's Wraithbone, which is a very, very pale cream. At this point, if I make a mistake, and I'll probably make a mistake, it doesn't really matter if I end up getting any of that paint on the eyelids or the cheeks or the brows, because I'm going to be painting over it with the flesh tones. And for the flesh tones I'm using Citadel's Bugman's Glow, and I'm going to get this all over the exposed flesh on the torso. And again, it doesn't matter if I get any overspill on the leather harness or the belt or the hair, because I'm going to be painting them in their base tones afterwards. So any overspill I can just paint over. At this point I'm not doing anything fancy. All I'm doing is putting down the base tones. So the skin, obviously, the hair, the leather on the belt and the harness, and all of the metallic elements like the rings that hold his harness straps together and the embellishments on his war belt. For the metal I'm using Citadel's Lead Belcher as a base tone, and for the leather I'm using Citadel's Dried Bark. It's a very dark brown, as the name would imply, usually used for wood, but it also does a very, very good job of painting up dark brown leather. Next I'm going to fix up that gap where his wrist joins the rest of his arm. I've already put the base coating down on everywhere other than the bits that I'm going to be applying milliput to. I want to fill in that little gap right there. So I'm using 2-part milliput. One part is the milliput and the other part's the hardener, I think. But there's a little trick involving isopropyl alcohol that I learnt from an Italian YouTuber who also does models and goes by the name of Marco Frissoni. So first things first, we're going to get our milliput and hardener mixed up. Once that's done, you take a little of the alcohol and you add it to the milliput. Give it a good mix, and then you're going to find the liquid mixture of alcohol and milliput can actually be applied to your model in much the same way as a paint. And once that alcohol evaporates, and it will evaporate pretty quickly because it's alcohol, all that's left on the model is the milliput. And of course, once that milliput dries, it can be sanded and filed and shaped just like regular milliput, because that's what it is. And with the gap fixed, I can now carry on base coating the rest of this arm. And there it is, finished. Well, not finished, but fixed and base coated. It's a long way from being finished. And just for the sake of completeness, there's his weapon hand base coated. And here's the man himself. Now for the shading and highlighting, although I have cheated just a little bit and I've already applied some shading to his hair and beard. But here's where the real work starts, getting all of that flesh done. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to block out the major parts of the muscle groups with a lighter shade of flesh tone. And I'm only applying this to the most prominently raised areas of the flesh, so all of those big old muscle groups obviously, but also facial features like the nose, the eyebrows, the forehead, the top of the cheeks. Basically the areas that when you're looking at the model right now, they're not in shadow. So I'm staying away from all of the recesses. Now the paint that I'm using here is a mix of equal parts Bugman's Glow, which was the base tone that I used for the flesh, and Kislev Flesh, which is a much, much paler skin tone, also from Citadel. I don't want it to be too different from the base tone because that's going to make it more difficult when I come to blend the two areas of colour into each other later. And if you think that this process is going to take an awfully long time, you're 100% right. But it's an absolute walk in the park to what comes next when I blend, through a process that's known as glazing, the two different skin tones together, the base coat of Bugman's Glow and the highlighted area of a mixture of Bugman's Glow and Kislev Flesh. And with all of those highlights applied, blocking out all of those major surface areas, this is where the real work begins. You see how I'm just dabbing this glaze around the edges of the highlighted areas, around the boundaries between that highlighted lighter flesh tone and the darker base coat of flesh tone. I'm doing this to blend those two colours together because if you look at it right now you can see that it just doesn't look natural. There are too many harsh contrasts between the highlights and the recesses. So what I'm doing here is applying a glaze. Now a glaze sounds fancy, but it's really just a word used to describe an extremely watered down shade of paint. What I've done is I've mixed up a mid-tone between the darker base tone and the lighter highlight, covering those big old muscle groups. And I've watered it down so it's roughly the consistency of milk, in exactly the same way that you would water down a shade of paint to make a wash. But a wash is used as a shade to get into all of the recesses. Because it is so watery, it doesn't stick to raised surfaces and it just runs into the recesses and darkens them. And that's no good for me because I want the mid-tone that I'm applying to stay exactly where I paint it. I don't want it to just run off into the recesses. So what you then need to do once you've loaded your brush up with the glaze is to dry most of it off by dabbing it onto a tissue paper. That way it's going to stick to the areas of the model that you're actually applying the brush to. But it's still very, very thin paint. All you've done is remove most of the water. So it's still got that translucent, semi-transparent effect. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we want because I can apply it with precision. It's not going to just run off the areas of the model that it gets applied to. And because it's transparent, it's just applying a slight tint of a mid-tone between the lighter highlighted area and the darker base coat recess area where I'm applying it. And if you do this enough, and it's going to take a lot of coats, you should be able to eliminate that harsh contrast between the colour boundaries. There is an undeniable downside in using glazing as a blending technique. It takes forever. It probably took me around about 8 or 9 layers of glazing to get the effect that I wanted. And it took hours. The upside is because you've removed most of the water, the glaze dries very, very quickly. So there's no sitting around waiting for paint to dry before you begin work on the next layer of glazing. The other upside is that it's very forgiving of making mistakes because the tints that you're applying are so incredibly subtle that if you get it wrong and accidentally paint something that you didn't mean to paint, it's almost unnoticeable and very, very easy to fix. The only downside, of course, is how long it takes because there are multiple layers of glaze that have to be applied to get the effect that you want. So this is definitely not a technique for the impatient. My next big issue after applying the glaze was how to bring out the details like the scars and the nipples and the blood vessels. I mean, how do you paint nipply bits? I have no idea. I've never had to paint them before. So in the spirit of experimentation, I'm applying a red glaze this time to the nipples. I don't want them to be bright red, but I do want them to be darker than the surrounding flesh, because nipples are darker than the surrounding flesh. Hopefully this is going to work. Like I said, I've never tried it before. But it seems to be working. And unlike the glazing on the rest of the skin, I didn't have to apply 15 layers in order to get it looking the way I wanted it to. And it worked so well, I thought, you know what, I'll try the same technique around the scars and the blood vessels, because I have no idea how to highlight scars and blood vessels either. And as luck would have it, it turned out that a extremely thin red glaze over scars and blood vessels on white skin does an incredibly good job of bringing out the definition and contrast on scars and blood vessels as well. So, job done? Yeah, not quite. There's still a way to go. I did some off-camera cheating on some of the other parts, like the hair, for example, which was shaded a dark steel grey wash and then dry brushed white, but I need to get this leather looking, well, like worn and used leather, because I painted the leather dark brown. But worn leather isn't just one shade of brown, or whatever colour you've dyed it. Let me show you what I'm talking about. There we go. There's some worn dark brown leather for you. Now, that dark sort of chocolatey mahogany leather tone, that's not the natural colour of the leather. That's a result of the dyeing and tanning process. The actual natural colour of the leather is what you can see around the edges, where all the dye has been worn away. And that's what I'm attempting to replicate here. In this case, I'm using Citadel's Mornfang Brown, which is a sort of medium brown tone, and just dabbing it and tracing it and stippling it over the edges of the leather harness straps, which have been painted in that very dark, chocolatey Citadel dried bark. In fact, if I pause it and zoom it in here while the camera's still got good focus, I'm not trying to overdo it here, I just want the suggestion that this is an extremely worn and well-used war harness. It's details like this that you might not even consciously notice when you're looking at the figure, but your brain will, and it'll help sell the illusion that you're looking at something that's real. The last thing that I need to do is get his remaining beard braids and ponytail attached and painted up to match the rest of his hair colour, and then we can stick a pin in this and call it done. So that is Bress the OId Barbarian from Black Sun Miniatures. I honestly think this is the best painting job I have done yet. I mean, it should be. Everything that you paint should be better than the last thing that you painted, but this is leaps and bounds ahead of anything that I've done before. This is going to be an extremely tough act for me to follow, but follow it I shall. And while I am very, very happy with the finished result here, I'm already looking at it and just seeing things that were wrong. The Warhammer, for example, could have been a lot better. But, well, for somebody who didn't know how to paint skin a couple of weeks ago, I'm pretty happy with this result. And who knows, maybe that'll provide some inspiration for some of you, because if I couldn't paint skin 2 weeks ago and I'm producing this now, well, if I can do it, anybody can do it. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope maybe it's inspired some of you to have a go yourself. And as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.